The sound comes before the shock. Metal. Leg shackles scraping against a courtroom floor in New York City. And then Nicolas Maduro walks in, not as a symbol, not as an idea, but in jail colors, under guard, facing a judge who asks him to confirm his name. Like, this is routine. Maduro doesn't raise his voice. He doesn't plead. He says he was kidnapped, taken from his home in Caracas, brought here against his will. I'm watching a moment where power doesn't disappear, it changes form. A president asks to keep a yellow legal pad, carefully taking notes, as if precision itself might still protect him. This isn't chaos, it's procedure, and that's what makes it unsettling. If you think this is just a dramatic arrest, stay with me, because understanding why this scene exists matters more than the scene itself. Next, we need to be clear about what this moment actually represents and what it doesn't. To understand this moment, we have to strip it down to what is actually happening and what is not. This is not a press conference. It's not a diplomatic standoff. It's not even a spectacle designed for television. It's a federal arraignment. A judge asks a man who calls himself a sitting president to confirm his identity so the process can begin. Charges are read, rights are explained, a plea is entered, the machinery moves forward without pause. Maduro says he is a prisoner of war. The court treats him as a defendant. That tension between how he defines himself and how the system defines him is the center of gravity here. He pleads not guilty. So does his wife. They do not ask for bail. They are transferred to a New York jail. Nothing about this is loud. Nothing about it is rushed. And that quiet, procedural normalcy is exactly what gives this moment its weight. Because when institutions act calmly, they signal confidence and consequences. To see how we arrived here, we have to step back before the courtroom doors ever opened. To understand how a sitting leader ends up here, you have to rewind past the courtroom and into the sequence that made this possible. This didn't begin in New York. It began at a compound in Venezuela, overnight, with a surprise operation carried out by US forces. An arrest, simultaneous strikes on military bases, speed, coordination, and shock. From that moment on, everything followed a chain reaction. Maduro and his wife are moved out of the country, charged not just with one allegation, but with an entire framework. Narco-terrorism conspiracy, cocaine importation, weapons, machine guns, destructive devices. The language matters. These are charges designed to redefine a person's role in the system. Once that line is crossed, the setting changes. A federal courtroom, a 92-year-old judge, an arraignment scheduled, then executed, with methodical precision. This is how power is relocated, not all at once, but step by step, through process. And once that machinery is in motion, the most volatile moments are still ahead. Because the first real rupture doesn't happen during an arrest. It happens when the narrative breaks in public. The rupture comes inside the room. It happens when a man from the public gallery suddenly shouts that Maduro will pay for his crimes. The courtroom freezes. Marshals move in. The outburst is brief, but the response is instant. Maduro turns. His voice rises for the first time. I am a president and a prisoner of war. That sentence lands harder than any charge sheet. Because it's not a legal argument. It's a declaration of identity shouted into a system that doesn't recognize it. The judge doesn't engage. The process doesn't stop. The man is escorted out in tears. This is the first true crisis moment. Not violence, not chaos, but exposure. A former leader in jail clothing, claiming the language of war inside a civilian court. A courtroom absorbing political theater without reacting to it. If you're still with me, this is where the story turns. Because when a system refuses to argue with power, it's usually because it believes it already has it. And next, we need to talk about the mechanism beneath this silence, the part no one sees, but everyone feels. What's happening here only makes sense if you understand the mechanism at work, the one operating beneath the courtroom dialogue. This case isn't built around emotion. It's built around classification. The US doesn't treat Maduro as a head of state inside this room. It treats him as a participant in criminal conspiracies, narco-terrorism, cocaine importation, weapons possession. That shift is deliberate. Once those labels are applied, sovereignty stops functioning as a shield. That's why the courtroom feels so controlled. Maduro speaks through an interpreter. He takes notes. He asks to keep his legal pad. These details matter because they show adaptation, a man recalibrating to a system where symbolism carries no legal weight. The judge doesn't debate his claims. He schedules the next hearing. The system doesn't need to persuade. It only needs to proceed. This is how institutional power works when it's confident. It absorbs disruption and continues forward. And once that mechanism locks in place, pressure doesn't release, it builds. Because the second crisis doesn't come from words shouted in court. It comes from the consequences unfolding outside it. The second crisis doesn't announce itself with shouting. It unfolds quietly, through transfer orders and locked doors. Maduro and his wife are taken from the courtroom to a New York jail. No bail requested, no immediate release. Just federal custody, indefinite, procedural, sealed by routine. This is where the reality sharpens. A man who once commanded institutions is now subject to them. Movement controlled, communication filtered, time dictated by court schedules and guard rotations. Power compresses. Inside the courtroom earlier, Maduro appeared calm, almost surgical. But here, calm becomes containment. The spectacle ends. The system closes in. Outside, the impact ripples. A Venezuelan journalist in the courtroom speaks about U.S. missile strikes damaging her family home near Fuerte Tiuna. Collateral effects, far from Manhattan, suddenly tied to this quiet transfer. That's the second crisis. Not confrontation, but permanence. Because once someone enters federal custody under these charges, exit is no longer political, it's procedural. And from here, the story stops being about leaders and courts. It starts becoming about people. This is where you enter the story. Because no matter how distant this courtroom feels, its consequences don't stay confined to it. You hear it in the voice of the Venezuelan reporter sitting in the room. She isn't talking about politics. She's talking about her family home damaged by missile strikes during the operation that led to this arrest. A home near Fuerte Tiuna, a place that now carries the cost of a decision made far above her. This is how power decisions land, not in headlines. In bedrooms, in neighborhoods, in silence after the noise fades. Maduro and his wife sit in custody, headphones translating a system that no longer bends to them. Meanwhile, ordinary people absorb the shockwaves, uncertainty, fear, disbelief. And if you're watching this thinking it's distant, abstract, foreign pause, because systems don't test their limits on the powerful alone. They test them on everyone connected to the fallout. If stories like this matter to you not as spectacle, but as warning, stay here, share this, talk about it. Because what happens next doesn't stop at one country's border. And that's exactly where we're going next. What happens in that courtroom doesn't stay contained within it, because the moment a sitting leader is moved across borders, the implications widen. This arrest isn't just legal, it's geopolitical. US forces operating overnight in Venezuela, military bases struck, a head of state transferred to New York. Every step sends a signal, not just to Caracas, but to capitals watching closely. This is about precedent. When one country demonstrates it can reach into another, remove leadership, and place them inside its own judicial system, the message travels fast. Allies reassess risk, adversaries reassess exposure. Neutral states reassess assumptions they thought were stable. And the language matters here too. Narco-terrorism, conspiracy, destructive devices. These are charges that don't just criminalize individuals, they justify reach. That's why reactions aren't limited to outrage or applause. They're strategic, quiet, calculated. Because once this line is crossed, it doesn't uncross easily. And the most important question now isn't what happened, it's what happens next when the world decides whether this was an exception or a template. From here, the future doesn't move in a straight line. It splits. There are three paths this moment can take. The first is containment. The legal process continues quietly. Hearings are scheduled, arguments are made, the case becomes long, procedural, almost invisible to the public. In this scenario, the system proves its point without escalation. Power is absorbed, neutralized, and managed through routine. The message is restraint force used once, law used afterward. The second path is instability. The arrest hardens positions. Supporters and opponents reinterpret the event through ideology, not evidence. The courtroom becomes a symbol rather than a venue. Diplomatic relationships strain. Narratives outrun facts. In this version, the system still functions, but trust erodes around it. The third path is the most dangerous. Precedent becomes policy. The idea that borders can be crossed to extract leadership under criminal framework spreads. Other nations adapt defensively, aggressively, preemptively. Law and force blur. What began as a singular case turns into a model others prepare for. None of these futures are guaranteed. All of them are possible. And the difference between them won't be decided by one judge or one defendant. It will be decided by how much power the world is willing to let procedure quietly hold. Which brings us to the final question and the final responsibility. This is where I want to slow down just enough to be honest with you. Because moments like this don't end when the courtroom empties. A president stands in shackles and calls himself a prisoner of war. A judge schedules the next hearing. The system moves on, but what lingers is the shift you can't unsee. Once you watch power submit to procedure, even briefly, your understanding of the world changes. You realize authority isn't permanent, protection isn't guaranteed, and legitimacy isn't something you declare. It's something systems either recognize or ignore. This case isn't just about Nicolas Maduro. It's about what happens when law decides it can outlast politics. If you're still here, don't treat this as spectacle. Treat it as information. Because the next time a courtroom like this fills with cameras, it may involve a different country, a different leader, a different justification. And when that happens, the only real defense is understanding how we got here. If this helped you see the mechanism beneath the moment, stay with me. Share this. Because the next story won't feel this shocking, and that's exactly why it will matter more.